Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you the family tree of classical Jewish rabbis. Some of these rabbis were related in the traditional sense, such as those who belonged to the house of Hillel. There we get a series of father-son relationships. However, other rabbis were related only by way of a teacher-student relationship. These are shown on the chart as well, but with thin black arrows indicating who influenced who. Either way, the rabbis we are going to be discussing are the ones whose views ended up being recorded in the Mishnah, which is the earliest part of the Talmud. I'll be using this brand new poster designed by fellow YouTuber Sam Aronow. It's titled Early Judaism Family Tree and is available exclusively from usefulcharts.com. If you'd like to buy a copy, you can head over to the website now, or you can click the link on screen at the end of the video. We're going to start with a Jewish high priest named Jaddua. According to Josephus, it was he who was in charge of the Second Temple in Jerusalem when Alexander the Great conquered Persia. It was thus he who oversaw the transition between Persian rule and Greek rule, something that actually went quite smoothly. Jaddua's descendants became known as the Oniads, or the House of Onias, named after the next high priest, Onias I. The Oniads went on to hold the high priesthood for most of the Greek period, with their most famous member being perhaps Simon the Just. During this period, the high priest was certainly the most important Jewish leader. After all, they held a hereditary position that went all the way back to the days of the First Temple. However, other types of religious leaders started to become more and more influential as well. These included various scribes and sages who were experts in Jewish law. Eventually, these other religious leaders split into various factions, the two main ones being the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In this video, we are going to focus on the Pharisees, because it is their intellectual descendants who became known as rabbis, and it was the rabbis who laid the groundwork for post-temple Judaism. Therefore, the next person I'm going to point out is Antigonus of Soko, who was a student of Simon the Just. Antigonus is quoted as having said, "Be not like servants who serve their master for the sake of reward. Rather, be like servants who do not serve their master for the sake of reward." This idea represented a fundamental shift in Jewish thinking. If you look at almost any story or prophetic writing in the Jewish Bible, the lesson is always do good and good things will happen to you. Do bad and bad things will happen to you. So the idea was that one should obey God so that one will be rewarded. But Antigonus said, no, don't do good to get a reward. Do good because, well, it's the right thing to do. This is why, to this day, Jews don't put much of an emphasis on concepts like heaven or on what a person needs to do in order to, quote-unquote, be saved. Most Jews do believe in some sort of an afterlife, but tend to be agnostic about the details, because it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we do what is right in this life, without trying to be rewarded for it. Anyway, Antigonus's views ended up having an impact on two men named Yosei ben Yoser and Yosei ben Yohanan. Note that in Hebrew, ben simply means son of. So we have a Yosei son of Yoser and a Yosei son of Yohanan. These two men were the first to serve as the leaders of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a judicial assembly that came to exist during the Hasmonean period. The president of this assembly was known as the Nasi, which also means prince, and the vice president was known as the Av Beit Din, which roughly translates as chief justice. So for the next 200 years, we get pairs of leaders, which is why this period is known as the Zugot. zugot being the Hebrew word for pairs. The fifth pair, Hillel and Shammai, are the two most important, or at least the most well-known. They are the founders of two houses, or schools of thought, known as the House of Hillel and the House of Shammai. It is with the emergence of these two houses that we move from the period of the Zugot to the period of the Tanaim. The word Tanaim meaning something like teachers. And it is with the emergence of the Tanaim that one of the most fundamental Jewish traits was born, the tendency to see value in argument and disagreement. As the saying goes, for every two Jews, there are at least three opinions. I'll explain what the Talmud is later in this video, but for now, you should know that much of the Talmud is a record of debates. For example, there are lots of passages in which the House of Hillel and the House of Shammai disagree on how to interpret a certain aspect of Jewish law. The Talmud records both opinions so that the reader can see both sides. Generally speaking, the House of Shammai was more strict, and the House of Hillel was more lenient. Also, please note that the opinions of the House of Hillel tend to be the ones that are followed today. Ever hear the phrase, "do unto others as you would have them do unto you"? This is known as the Golden Rule, and it is usually attributed to Jesus. However, it can actually be traced back to Hillel, who initially said, "Don't do to others that which you wouldn't want them to do to you." So let's now take a look at the family tree of the House of Hillel. Hillel was followed by his son Simon, of whom very little is known, and then by Simon's son Gamliel. Gamliel is notable for several reasons. First of all, he's considered to be one of the greatest Jewish teachers of all time. He was also the first person to be called Rabban, a word closely related to rabbi. Finally, he is the only one of the Tanaim who is clearly named in the Christian New Testament, even though the Tanaim and the first few generations of Christians lived at the exact same time. In the book of Acts, Gamliel is mentioned as having been a teacher of the Apostle Paul. Paul, of course, went on to become the most important figure in the development of Christianity, other than Jesus himself. Serving alongside Gamliel as Av Beit Din was Yohanan ben Zakkai. He's generally the person considered to have been the first official rabbi. He outlived Gamliel and therefore also served alongside Gamliel's son, Simon. Simon and Yohanan were therefore the two leaders of the Sanhedrin in the year 70 CE, when the Romans laid siege on Jerusalem. However, each one met with a very different fate. Simon was beheaded just before the temple was destroyed. Yohanan, on the other hand, is said to have escaped the city in a coffin. Supposedly, he managed to arrange a meeting with General Vespasian, in which he predicted that Vespasian would go on to become the emperor. According to legend, Vespasian offered Yohanan 3 wishes, and one of the things that Yohanan asked for was permission for he and his students to relocate to the city of Yavne and establish a school there. Vespasian allowed this, and thus, in the year 70 CE, the center point for Jewish scholarship moved from Jerusalem to Yavne. There, Yohanan ben Zakkai took on the role of Nasi, as well as that of Av Beit Din, teaching students such as Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Joshua ben Hananiah. Eventually, however, the title of Nasi passed back to the House of Hillel, with Simon's son, Gamliel II, taking on that role in 80 CE. However, the most important teacher during this period was arguably Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph. He is referred to in the Talmud as being the chief of the sages, and he was very instrumental in the final canonization of the Jewish Bible. For example, it was he who argued that the book of Sirach should not be included, but that the book of Esther should. In fact, the 4 rabbis who are cited by name most frequently in the Talmud were all students of Rabbi Akiva. The person whose name is mentioned most often is Rabbi Judah, followed by Rabbis Meir, Simon bar Yochai, and Joseph ben Halafta. It was during the period when Rabbi Akiva was the main teacher at Yavne that a Jewish military leader named Simon bar Kokhba arrived on the scene. In Aramaic, bar Kokhba means son of the star, and was a nickname given to him by Rabbi Akiva, based on Akiva's belief that Simon was the promised Messiah. And for a while, it seemed as if Akiva was correct. Bar Kokhba revolted against the Romans and managed to rule as prince of an independent Jewish state for 3 years, from 132 to 135 CE. But eventually, the Romans put down the revolt, albeit with very heavy losses. Bar Kokhba died, and Rabbi Akiva was captured, tortured, and publicly executed. It was at this point that Jews were barred from entering the city of Jerusalem, and that Judea was renamed Syria-Palestine. According to legend, only one Jewish fighter was spared, Simon, son of Gamliel II. He thus went on to serve as Nasi after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Rabbi Akiva's 4 main students all survived the revolt as well. Of the 4, Simon bar Yochai is perhaps the most notable. Traditionally, he is credited with having written the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, a form of Jewish mysticism that arose over 1,000 years later. However, it is very unlikely that he was the one who actually wrote it. Simon bar Yochai is thought to have died on the 18th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, which is also known as the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer. Nowadays, this day is celebrated by some Jews as Lag BaOmer. In Israel, tens of thousands of people go on an annual pilgrimage to Simon bar Yochai's tomb on this day. And earlier this year, the event sadly hit the news due to a deadly crowd crush in which 45 people were killed. Okay, we now come to Judah Hanasi, son of Simon ben Gamliel II, which means that I can finally explain to you what the Talmud is. The first thing you need to know is that the Talmud actually has 2 parts, the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah, also known as the Oral Torah, was compiled by Judah Hanasi. Basically, he took all of the various rulings of the many rabbis we've just discussed and put them all together into a single book. Prior to this, these legal opinions were only passed down from teacher to student orally. Many Jews believe that these oral traditions can be traced all the way back to Moses, and therefore this is why they consider the Mishnah to be an oral Torah, on par with the written Torah. As you can see from the bottom of this chart, the Tanaim, which remember means teachers, were followed by the Amoraim, which means interpreters. So basically what happened was that the Amoraim developed interpretations of the legal opinions found in the Mishnah. Thus, a second layer of the Talmud developed, known as the Gemara. And in fact, over time, more layers developed as well. So what you end up with is interpretations of interpretations of interpretations, etc. Remember how I mentioned earlier that Jews find value in debate and in a multitude of opinions? Well, the Talmud basically encapsulates this value in its very form. If you look at a typical page from the Talmud, you'll notice that it has a unique structure. You often get the Mishnah and the Gemara in the middle with various other commentaries wrapped around them. Okay, so that was a look at some of the main classical rabbis from the Zugot and Tanaim periods. Once again, if you're interested in buying a copy of Sam's chart as a poster, you can head over to usefulcharts.com. It also includes many key figures from other parts of ancient Jewish history as well, including kings from King David to Herod the Great. Thanks for watching.